Have you ever looked at someone and thought something along the lines of, "God, you are pathetic"? You don't even necessarily dislike them, you just behold the mess of a human being before you and feel pity. Something has clearly gone horribly wrong, whether or not it was their fault, and whether or not you hate them, you feel sorry for them. This is the feeling I get looking at the Death Guard. When they finally found Mortarion, their Primarch brought with him a whole load of bitterness and baggage. Even though they were suited for the wars and environment they fought in during the Great Crusade, they're certainly not places you envied them for being able to handle. Despite being one of the more competent legions, they were surrounded almost entirely by other Space Marines and soldiers that were absolutely losing their minds during the heresy. They kept having to fight the White Scars in spite of the fact that they're arguably the perfect counter to the Death Guard, or at the very least incredibly annoying to fight. And to top it all off, their fall to chaos was just hard to watch. You can combine Eternal Torment with the fact that most of them didn't even want what happened to them. And indeed, their souls being sold to Nurgle for all time came about because Dad, even with all his bitterness and baggage, only did it because he loved them and wanted to see their suffering stop. All of this is depressing stuff, and it can make you look at the Death Guard with sadness. But on the flip side, sometimes it can be hard to feel bad for them. Certainly by the time of 40k, because the Death Guard have killed more Imperials than any other traitor legion out there. When they arrive, armies crumble into their component parts, the air is choked with a miasma unmatched by even the foulest smelling hobby store patron, and the very planet they land on will become sick and diseased. And since I'm nearing the point I only have Chaos armies left in Do or Don't for 40k, maybe it's best to knock some of them off the list. So if you want to plot across the galaxy, slowly spreading the love of Grandfather Nurgle in your wake, then step on up and see if the Death Guard aren't the army for you. But before we talk about Warhammer 40k's smelliest army, allow me to tell you about something that doesn't stink. Raycon and their Everyday Earbuds, the sponsor of this video. Now Raycon's Everyday Earbuds have plenty going for them, but how about I just sit up straight and tell you one of the best things? Same audio quality as other earbuds you might have heard of, but half the price. And if you don't believe me, believe the fact that they've sold 3 million of the previous Everyday Earbuds. If these things weren't the real deal and were in fact crap, people wouldn't have bought 3 million of the things. But you might notice, my eagle-eyed viewer, that I said the previous earbuds, because they've upgraded them and now they're better than ever. With a sleek ergonomic design, multi-point connectivity so you can share your music, and new active noise cancellation features, these bad boys are truly the best way to listen to whatever you could possibly want to. But my personal favorite features, truth be told, are much simpler ones. A 32-hour battery life is something that I can only describe as a gift from the very heavens, because I forget that my battery-powered devices need a charged battery to work. But even better is the quick charge function. 10 minutes of charging gives you 90 minutes of battery life, because more than being forgetful, I am impatient. I want my stuff to instantly become fully charged when I so much as look at a charging cable, and the upgraded Raycon Everyday Earbuds have gotten me closer to that wonderful reality than ever before. Since I occasionally remember that I should probably work on at least one miniature every now and then, I've been using them for background noise while I paint. It's nice and relaxing. I just throw on a podcast or some game soundtrack or other and zone out, and the Everyday Earbuds are great for that. Or some Hatsune Miku song or other, they're very motivating. If all this sounds appealing to you, and it had damn well better, these are good quality earbuds, you can get yourself a pair at a discount. Click the link in the description box or go to buyraycon.com/PancreasNoWork to get 15% off your Raycon purchase, plus free shipping. Get Raycon's Everyday Earbuds today and listen to your favorite music, podcasts, and more like never before. Now then, it's time to smell horribly. The Death Guard are, of course, Space Marines, so they get their start during the Great Crusade. Slightly before, actually, but who cares about the Unification Wars? They were known as the Dusk Raiders because their standard method of attacking was to attack during the dusk. It's a solid strategy. Most of the army's getting ready to rest, guards might only have just been assigned, and everyone's settling down. Then a whole bunch of super soldiers blitz in out of nowhere, and everything gets resolved nice and cleanly. This will probably be the last time I describe the Death Guard as clean. Want to see me sum up the entirety of the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy in just a few paragraphs? Because I'm gonna. Once they met Mortarion, they doubled down on the things that made them unique. The Dusk Raiders, coming from Mortarion's gene seed, had always been hardy lads. You don't just send them to a war of attrition, you send them to a war of attrition that's taking place in Blighttown, or Caelid, or any one of Miyazaki's poisonous swamps. Bullets didn't faze them, and neither did an atmosphere of 90% chlorine gas, so they were handed missions that arguably make the ones the Iron Warriors went on look easy. Mortarion also, to simplify things, had a bit of a survival of the fittest mindset. Added onto this was the fact that Mortarion only really recruited from his homeworld of Barbarous if he could help it, and since that entire planet was just a toxic waste dump, this made the now renamed Death Guard even hardier. They regularly used weapons that other legions would only ever break out in specialized squads, such as rad weaponry and other fun flavors of war crimes. By the time of the Horus Heresy, they numbered just under 100,000 Marines. Certainly not the biggest legion, but that's a pretty good amount. That's more Space Marines than you command, bozo. They were organized in 7 great companies. Mortarion had a guard called the Death Shroud that had to stay within 49 steps of him at all times, which is 7 times 7. And hey, did you know Nurgle's sacred number is 7? Probably not important. I bet they're just really big fans of Bungie. What is important is Mortarion being bitter about Dad in the Imperium. The whole thing just reeked of being no different than the tyrants he grew up under and then came to fight on Barbarous, and he wasn't a fan of the blatant warpcraft the Emperor was accepting within the Imperium either. So for that and a variety of other reasons, the Death Guard marched to war under the banner of Horus. And on the one hand, the Death Guard was absolutely one of the few traitor legions that didn't go completely off the rails during it. Mortarion, in spite of a bit of a descent into madness as he came to terms with both his own psychic powers as well as the fact his allies were summoning demons left, right, and center, was one of the few traitor Primarchs to keep a pretty firm head on his shoulders. Even once he became a demon Primarch, he kept at it, and the Death Guard during the Siege of Terra were one of the more reliable legions. That's not much of a high bar because we're comparing them to the World Eaters and Emperor's Children, but it's still worth giving them some credit for. They were even the last traitor legion to leave Terra once the siege was over, so they held the line at the end above all the rest. On the other hand, it wasn't all so well and good for him, because they kept having to fight the White Scars, and that is the worst opponent they could have faced. The Death Guard are slow and methodical. They lumber through everything you bring to bear against them to bring you down. The White Scars do not spend more than half a second standing still and move at the speed of fast. So while the Death Guard aren't pushovers by any means, this more often than not ended up as a grimdark Tom and Jerry chase. At the Siege of Terra, Mortarion was in fact banished by Jagged-Eye Khan, who took his firm head to clean off his shoulders. Yeah, it was kind of a mutual kill, but that's a minor point. And then there's the business of their fall to chaos. The Death Guard were tricked by their first captain Typhon into killing all their navigators after he said they were loyalist spies. All of them were, he swore. But don't worry, Typhus also swore he could get them to Terra for realsies. Which, you know, the Death Guard did eventually reach Terra, no lies were told. But he omitted the fact that he was also going to leave the Legion stranded for a bit while they all suffered from the Destroyer Plague, which inflicted untold levels of agony on the Legion designed to resist this very sort of thing. Because they were so hardy, it didn't kill them, but it did leave the most hardened warriors in the galaxy screaming for death on the floor. Mortarion sold their souls to Nurgle to end the pain, Typhon became Typhus by turning into a bug hive, and then yada yada yada, Emperor dies, Horus dies harder, time to flee to the Eye of Terror. The Death Guard were one of the more organized legions, however. While Mortarion for the most part didn't really do much besides turn their gifted demon world into a recreation of Barbarous, they do in theory still have a centralized command structure all the way up to Mortarion. Typhus took a whole bunch of the Legion and created the Plague Fleet that would go on to get the highest kill count out of all the traitors, since instead of having to actually fight anyone, they can just airdrop every disease ever onto a hive world. Others like the Iron Warriors and Wordbearers certainly are more organized, but the Death Guard are a nice middle ground between still efficiently working together and no one is working together even under the pain of death. The ones in the Plague Fleet largely follow Typhus instead of Mortarion, but when the Death Guard goes to war, you can be assured that there is a chain of command being followed to most efficiently spread the love of Nurgle. Come the modern days of 40k, and the Death Guard have continued on this way for 10,000 years. The most active of them is probably Typhus and his Plague Fleet, but between the other Legion warbands as well as the Black Legion, seeing the Death Guard scattered around the galaxy is by no means uncommon. Come the 13th Black Crusade and the Great Rift, they were out and about in numbers never before seen alongside the rest of the traitors. And come the Indomitus Crusade, Mortarion himself finally decided to make something of his demonic life and alongside his sons took a nice bite out of Ultramar, forming the Plague Star's mini-empire in real space. Sure, he got sent back to the warp by Guilliman, and sure, the Emperor himself lit Nurgle's garden on fire and pissed all over the guy, but the threat of these nasty bastards is still felt keenly. The Tau in particular seem to be one of their latest targets, although let's be frank, Mortarion and his sons aren't enough for that. All of the Traitor Legion? Yeah, no shot, see you later, Tau. But the Death Guard alone? A legion of slow-moving goobers like them sounds like railgun target practice, no matter how many plagues they throw at the forces of the greater good. And that's about all the info you need to go into the Death Guard. Heresy fans can complain if they must because I breezed over all of it, but people who spread the Black Plague at gunpoint is honestly all you really need to know about the Death Guard going in. So, why play them? For the lore, having traitors whose fall to chaos wasn't beyond stupid is very nice. Yes, I'm talking to you, Emperor's Children fans. You can say whatever you want about Mortarion being an unbelievable hypocrite in the heresy, or how stupid it was to trust Typhus after he killed all the people whose job it was to navigate the warp. Doesn't change the fact that Fulgrim's fall to chaos amounts to Penis Sword, and all his remaining children just went with it. The Death Guard fell because their very biology worked against them, and their Primarch felt too strongly about wanting his son's suffering to stop. It does in some ways take agency out of their fall, but to me it also means they well and truly do come across as damned. Other traitor legions or space Marine chapters that turned since can come across as outright moronic for joining Chaos. The Death Guard, you just feel sorry. They weren't given much choice in the matter, and it was forced upon them. They're also an active traitor legion with a very high kill count, so there's no worries about your faction being either weak, inactive, or in last place. Mortarion was a lazy sack of sadness and bitterness until recently, but most everyone else at least left the house every now and again. Now I can already hear some very smart and clever individuals going, actually it doesn't count, they killed people with plagues, that's cheating. And I have two rebuttals for that. One is that without the Death Guard showing up and spreading those plagues, they wouldn't have happened. Two is that even if it is cheating, so what? A dead Imperial is a dead Imperial, doesn't matter how we got there. Getting sick and dying is equally as valid as getting shot and dying. In fact, in this case it might even be better. The sick person in question might become a Plague Bearer, Poxwalker, or some other flavor of Nurgle Force. That's a whole other positive all to its own. The Death Guard can not only get the highest potential kill count because disease is responsible for more war deaths than actual combat, but their kill count can get back up and join their side. And they don't even need to be there to get people killed, just plant some diseases and leave. By the time they come back, the whole planet is overrun with sickness and ripe for Papa Nurgle's love. As I said before, they're also organized, and in a nice middle ground between strict hierarchies and people just doing whatever the hell they want for fun. Aside from giving the Legion flexibility, this gives you plenty of room to work with in creating your own homebrew Death Guard force. They can be soldiers who carefully follow orders and have a regimented command structure, or you can fluff your army to be jolly old lads who just want to spread the gifts of Nurgle and don't really care for how Mortarion or Typhus tells them to do it. As long as your homebrew army smells like ass, you can do almost anything you want with it. There's even a warband of Chaos Marines called the Purge that follow Nurgle who want everyone to have the most idyllic life possible, and they believe they can purge away the rot in the galaxy to do it. This sounds great, except for the fact that they believe the problem is life itself, and they need to do a hard reset so it can emerge from the ashes anew. So there's plenty of room to work with, be it evil spreaders of disease or whatever people like the Purge have gaslit themselves into believing. Not quite the Death Guard proper, but hey, they follow Nurgle and that's close enough. Just grab some normal Marines and paint them sickly green and use Death Guard rules, same difference. And of course, they're Space Marines. Chaos Space Marines, so it is true they don't have quite the plot armor of normal Space Marines. But GW is certainly going to treat the Death Guard with a lot more respect than say the Orcs or the Eldar, or anyone who isn't in some way human. I mean, they managed to take over part of Ultramar. And Mortarion killed Guilliman, even if Big E undid it. Can you imagine telling someone a decade ago that Ultramar would be losing territory to Chaos and Grandpa Smurf himself was killed? They'd have laughed in your face, yet here we are. And while they don't have the most Horus Heresy books, they are one of the original traitor legions, so you can already find them being referenced or appearing in plenty of novels to some degree. And the Dark Imperium books had them as the major antagonists. Not exactly the same as a novel focused on them as the main characters, but there is a decent hunk of lore you can find out there with them in it. Yeah, you can always point to someone else like the Ultramarines and go, they have more books, but all things considered, it's not like they're barren on the lore side of things. Hey Leagues of Votann fans, how you doing? Has that single book GW supposedly writing come out yet? Hope it does soon if it hasn't. Hope even more that it doesn't completely suck. For the tabletop, the most basic thing to know the Death Guard have going for them is that they are all fat and tanky bastards. 2 wounds, a 3-up save, and toughness 5 is what your standard Plague Marine has, and they can be taken in units of 5, 7, or 10. Your opponent's either going to need to dedicate some decently heavy-hitting weapons or a large amount of weaker ones if they want to take these guys down. This, of course, extends even further once you start looking at characters. Mortarion isn't going down easy no matter what you throw at him, and in fact, when GW was hyping up the new avatar of Cain, he was the only one to defeat him in all the results they had shown. A 2-up save and a 4-up invuln are by no means uncommon to keep your special characters alive, and the only things I actually saw that have bad saves are Cultists and Poxwalkers. Cultists have a 6-up and Poxwalkers a 7-up, so yeah, they're gonna be dying in droves. But those models are chaff, they're not supposed to be tanking hits left and right, and the Poxwalkers in particular, while still being ass in terms of pure stats, have both a 5-up feel no pain and can resurrect a model for everyone they kill. Typhus can also buff this ability a bit if he's leading a unit of them, letting models he kills with his psychic attack resurrect. So funnily enough, the worst thing an enemy player can possibly do is dedicate their own chaff to fighting these guys. At least in melee, if you can snipe them from far away at range, then that's not too bad a way to deal with Poxwalkers. So your units are either tanky as hell, or they don't need to be tanky. You can also give any infantry in range of a Death Guard Demon Prince a 6-up feel no pain. Shame that's not a standard feature anymore like it used to be, but you can still kind of recreate it if you try hard enough. For that matter, there's a few different healing shenanigans the Death Guard have. There's of course the Poxwalker zombie ability, but a Plague Surgeon can heal up to 3 wounds on an infantry character. You can only do this once per turn on a given character, so you can't take 3 Plague Surgeons and make an Immortal Typhus, but 2 or 3 of these guys in your army can ensure that your characters are even more infuriatingly hard to kill than they already are. He can also resurrect a model per turn, because why not? There's also the Gifts of Decay stratagem, which, while being a bit finicky with a D3 heal, unless you're near an infected objective, can be used to heal anything, so just give it to Mortarion. Never let him die. Have an immortal demon Primarch walk up and down the battlefield, brutalizing whatever you throw him at. Speaking of brutalizing, for a variety of reasons, the death card can become pretty damn scary on the tabletop when they're in the swing of things. The main thing helping them in this regard is their Nurgle's Gift aura. While I have some things to say about it negative later on, depending on the situation, it can be incredibly strong. The main thing it does is that whenever a model is within range of it, they lose 1 toughness point. Flat out reduction, no additional work required beyond getting someone close to them. It starts out as 3 inches on turn 1, on turn 2 becomes 6 inches, and from turn 3 onwards it's 9 inches away from a model with the ability, which is all of them. Now let's take a look at the standard Plague Marine. Don't look at the whole host of options present here, we're just going to talk about the standard bolt gun and their knives for close combat, because both of them are strength 4. If your opponent is running Space Marines and is within the aura of Nurgle's Gift, these weapons now wound on 3s. If they're running most of the Eldar roster, you now wound them on 2s. This is an ability that automatically requires some work around to fight, because if they don't work around it, they're going to find out that their weaker units are dropping like flies. It also has 1 additional ability depending on which one you pick. I'd personally probably prefer the Rattlejoint aura just to go really all in on weakening enemy saves, but the Skullscream one ain't that bad either. The Scabrous one is probably helpful, but in my personal opinion, I think just murdering the enemy is a fine way of reducing the enemy's objective control and leadership. There's also, in academic terms, like a million different ways they have of causing lethal hits. Their standard bolt guns and close combat weapons have them, their characters have them, their vehicles have them. Just assume you have lethal hits on your units. Most of them do. A Biologus Putrefier can also let those lethal hits occur on a 5 instead of a 6, because what the Death Guard clearly needed was more lethal hits. I briefly mentioned it earlier, but the Death Guard retained that wonderful thing Loyalist Marines used to have: adaptability with their weapons. Remember the days when Space Marines weren't just Eldar aspect warriors? Good times. Terminators and Plague Marines have an absolute ton of weapon options to choose from, so you can fit your troops out for all sorts of encounters. And for some more general stuff they've got going for them, their stratagems have a variety of helpful benefits that aren't super standout, but can give some nice help to your army. Reducing damage, improving armor penetration, giving units stealth, or letting weapons fire more effectively. Nothing too phenomenal, but very nice stuff. There's also infected objectives, which I briefly mentioned earlier. At the end of your command phase, an objective you control and a Death Guard unit is near becomes infected. Aside from acting as a source of Nurgle's Gift, it can also stay under your control even if you leave it unless it's outright captured by the enemy. That's right, you could just leave. If the enemy doesn't have a unit either in reserve or a real fast one like a Wind Rider to take it from your back line, it's yours for the rest of the game. Don't worry about it. The Tallyman model can give you a free command point on a 2d6 roll of 7 or higher, and command points are always nice to have. And you've got some artillery in the form of the Myphitic Blade Launcher. The Plague Burst Crawler as well, just in case you wanted a little bit more range. The vehicles you get, as well as the Hellbrute that are shared with other Chaos Marine armies, get nice little Nurgle benefits, like the Hellbrute being able to force a unit to be counted as in contagion range, even if they're hit with one of the weapons it has with the 48-inch range. Mortarion, just to reiterate, is a monster, so have fun throwing him at something. He even gets a second set of his own plagues to buff nearby allies with. He's at home up close, but he's got some decent ranged power between his pistol and his psychic attack, Rotwind. The name of that power makes me wonder if he's either breathing on them with toxic halitosis or just ripping ass in the general direction of the enemy. And lastly, their models, which are all very nice stuff. There is a flip side coming later, but for now these things look exactly like Chaos Space Marines worshipping Nurgle should. They're completely disgusting, covered in pus and gas, and they look like they're just inundated in diarrhea. But, you know, in a good way. A good painter can bring these models to life, and Nurgle models, in my opinion, always stand out above the rest when painted well. They're just so vibrant and unpleasant to look at, which is a combination that rarely happens, but the modelers pulled it off. If that's your thing and you've got the skill and will, go for it, please. But for their lore cons, I think first and foremost we'll go back to what I said about them falling to chaos. You feel sad for them, because that's the feeling I get. With them having a bit less agency in their fall, and the specifics of it being what they were, I find it hard to argue that they're are, at least in motives and origins, one of the more pathetic Chaos Legions. There's not necessarily a raging cry against the tyranny of the Emperor, or at least not one at the heart of their fall. There was no great battle against one of the Loyalist Legions before their father took the plunge to save his sons like Magnus. There wasn't even a headfirst dive into it of their own volition, because at least the Emperor's children seemed to be having fun doing what they did. They were both simultaneously too tough and not tough enough, and the story of their father was the story of a man not being good enough from birth to damnation. I know I've said before that the Chaos Space Marines pale in the cool factor of their evilness compared to the Warriors of Chaos or Slaves to Darkness, but even amongst the Chaos Marines, the Death Guard can fall short if you look at them from beginning to end. At least personally, I don't want an army of pitiful sacks of rotting meat. Also a rather big issue is that Nurgle has taken quite the pounding relatively recently, with Big E resurrecting Guilliman and burning Nurgle's house down, which to my knowledge caused permanent damage to the god. You'll likely be in the backseat for quite some time now as other bad guy factions get their turn in the spotlight, and worst of all, when he possessed Guilliman, the Emperor told Mortarion that he could still be redeemed, and Mortarion didn't seem terribly aghast at the idea. While I don't think it would ever happen, playing Death Guard gives you one of the few traitor Primarchs that might one day somehow flip sides back to being a loyalist. They're also Chaos Space Marines, so you know almost everything they do is gonna get pushed back. Or if it isn't, it's not going to actually mean anything. Like, the Plague Stars are great and an honest-to-God victory, but it's one against the Imperium. They could have taken 50 star systems and turned them in their factories for plagues and great unclean ones, and it wouldn't be a drop in the bucket that is the Imperium's holdings. It isn't the Death Guard's fault, strictly speaking. It's GW's problem with 40k's narrative. Abaddon tore the galaxy in half, and all that happened was one half got a renaissance, and the other half is totally for real, guys. Super bad to live in, we swear. So a single legion of Chaos Space Marines causing problems? Nah, don't worry about it. Like I said, not their fault GW is determined to both move the setting forward and not move it an inch, but it is something you gotta live with. If it makes you feel better, at least you aren't the Inari. And I'm gonna be honest, I'm gonna start counting having an active Primarch as a lore con, because I don't want them. As I like to keep banging on about, to no one's satisfaction but myself, Primarchs eat attention away from every other cool character in the setting. They are black holes of the narrative, dragging everything around them into whatever they're doing, as no one else bothers to write about whatever everyone else is doing. What's Typhus doing? What's a smaller warband doing? Who cares, says GW, because we're turning 40k into the Horus Heresy Round 2. And if you think that the Primarchs are an integral part of the setting and you can't just ignore them like that, let me remind you that in Rogue Trader, the very first edition of 40k, Leman Russ was really just a dude. None of the Primarch nonsense we see now was present. These demigod sacks of shit can piss off for the rest of the setting's narrative, and we'd be better off for it. Of course, if you do care about the Primarchs, then everything I've just said can be safely ignored, and at the end of the day, they're going to sell like hotcakes. I wish GW would make them tabletop available and keep them out of the narrative, but for now I'll just have to be happy with wasting everyone's time by complaining that the setting isn't specifically catering to my neurotic tastes. And the last lore con is going to be a flip of one of the ones I mentioned earlier. If you are the kind of moron who thinks the only way to validly win a battle is to get up close and be all brave and heroic and beat the enemy to death with your throbbing warrior cock, the Death Guard aren't for you. They use plagues, chemical weapons, and more to defeat the enemy. They don't mind playing literally and figuratively dirty. So you don't want these traitors if that's what you're into. Kind of ironic given what some of their tabletop rules focus on, but in the lore at least, they're not all about being melee badasses. As for tabletop cons, the absolute biggest flaw the Death Guard has is that they're slow as hell. 4 to 5 inches of movement is standard for them, so if you don't take some dedicated transports to ferry the guys around, you're going to be very slowly foot-slogging up the battlefield. Their movement speed makes it kind of funny to me that the Nurgle's Blessing aura lets you keep objective markers under your control even after you leave them. Because depending on where a unit is when they capture them, there's a good chance that it won't even matter, because even after they advance, they're still going to be in an objective capturing range. Seriously though, you are almost certainly going to need a Land Raider or Rhino if you plan on going anywhere fast with this army. Every now and then you might use something that can jump scare your opponent with its movement, like a Demon Prince or Mortarion, but for the most part it's a case of slow and steady winning the race. The fact that some units like the Death Shroud Terminators and Typhus are almost useless outside of melee combat is going to be acutely felt when you come up against some asshole running swooping hawks that keeps jumping on top of buildings whenever you get remotely close. Nurgle's Blessing can also a lot of the time be rather disappointing. Against most factions' average troop types it can be absolutely killer, don't get me wrong, but there's a whole lot going into it to make it that way. For starters, it might as well not be active until turn 3, maybe turn 2 if you take some of their few fast units, as well as use something like the Hellbrute's ability to force an enemy to count as being in contagion range. Since Death Guard units are so slow and it starts at 3 inches, then 6 before finally turning into 9 inches on turn 3, there's a non-zero chance it won't actually do anything beyond letting you hold a backline objective early on. But even with that, there's enough tough units in the game that just don't care if you lower their toughness by 1. Let's discuss the avatar of Cain versus Mortarion again. Mortarion reducing his toughness by 1 brings Cain from 12 to 11 toughness. This doesn't mean anything. Using silence in strike mode means each attack has a strength value of 14, and going from 12 to 11 isn't enough to make the wound roll needed to hurt Cain any higher. All his other attacks were also more than half of Cain's toughness anyway, so those don't get better either. And this thing pretty much repeats across the majority of Death Guard weapons available. Pretty much every weapon is either going to be far enough below the toughness threshold that lowering Cain's by 1 doesn't matter, or only just above it so they once again don't actually wound any better. Your standard strength 4 bolter isn't going to be hurting Cain any more often when you lower his toughness from 12 to 11. It's just inconsequential. You also might have some trouble cracking the toughness of heavier units in enemy armies, especially at range. Now the medium range of toughness, things like Terminators and even up to Wraithguard, you should be able to handle with relatively few issues. In fact, there's enough strength 6 and 7 attacks in the Death Guard army that Nurgle's aura might actually be pretty phenomenal if you can use it well in this weight class, because Wraithguard going from toughness 7 to 6 means wounding on 4s or even 3s with these weapons. But once you start facing models with 10 and higher, you might have issues cracking through that. You absolutely have options, don't get me wrong. Mortarion can chop through those sorts of models with minimal effort, and taking a Land Raider or a Predator, especially an Annihilator with that 14th strength twin las cannon, can certainly put the hurt on tougher opponents. But for the more standard troops, toughness 9 or higher might be something they find hard to crack, even with Nurgle's gift reducing it. Not everyone can carry a plasma weapon or a melt-a-gun, so the normal Plague Marines will learn to fear the Wraithlord coming to beat them to death. For that matter, there's a slight lack in long-ranged options for the army as a whole, especially for cracking tougher targets. I say slight because you can find things with 48 inches of range, most prominently in my eyes the Plagueburst Crawler or the Myphitic Blight Hauler, but for the boots on the ground you need to be relatively close, and this is of course very problematic given their speed issues. The Death Guard excel at close to medium range combat, with a select few melee units getting up close and personal while Plague Marines and others close in behind them. You could expect things like the aforementioned Plagueburst Crawler to put some hurt on the enemy, so again I want to reiterate this isn't necessarily a crushing downside, just something to consider. Also unrelated, but every time I look at the Myphitic Blight Hauler, I think of that video where Squidward gets crushed by the contraption and Bad Romance is playing. Why do they have that machine in Bikini Bottom? Is it made for the nematode infestations? One perhaps more substantial issue is how character-focused their roster is. Looking on the web store, there's only really 4 units they have that aren't either a vehicle or an individual character. The Plague Marines, Poxwalkers, and the 2 Terminator variants they got. The standard rank and file of your army is going to be very similar across the board. Sure, you have all sorts of different options for how they play when it comes to deploying the special characters, but as an army it's much less so. The gameplay downside of this is that there's only so many tricks a Death Guard army can have across its main battle line. Play enough matches against the Death Guard and you'll probably be able to at least make an educated guess as to what your opponent is doing. Depending on how hard you go in with these various characters, you might also end up building an army relying on them to perform well, and if they die early, it could be game over for you. From a collecting standpoint, your army's going to look pretty similar across the board. Plague Marines and Terminator armor, and desiccated normal-looking people. That's your lot for 90% of the force. Their price point is also a bit up there. I was talking to some others recently, and they mentioned that this is admittedly more of a problem with 10th as a whole, since point costs across the board seem to have pretty substantially fallen. But either way, the end result of this is that if you want a full 2k point Death Guard army, it ain't cheap. Initially when writing this script, I was going to write that getting Mortarion is a great way to get a massive chunk of a Death Guard army collected for relatively cheaply, but then I double-checked his price in points as well as actual real people money. 325 points for $170, not including tax. That's less than 2 points per dollar, and the rest of the army has similar issues. Ignoring Mortarion, I think the only character that costs more than 100 points are the 2 Demon Prince variants you can take. A lot of these characters are around $30 for a model that's only 50 or so points. This is, as I said, something I think that's more of a 40k as a whole issue than just the Death Guard, but I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention that the Death Guard are facing this problem as well. Your wallet probably won't thank you for choosing the Death Guard price range compared to the Tyranid price range. You're bankrupt either way, even if you could be more bankrupt. This is also real low-hanging fruit, but we all agreed the Plague Marines coming in a kit of 7 is awful, right? Like, that's very cute, Games Workshop, but this is horrible. I don't care that 7 is Nurgle's thing. Give me 10 miniatures like everyone else gets. And who can forget that their combat patrol is abominable? Almost entirely Plague zombies and a named character in it. This is mostly units that are not Space Marines in the Chaos Space Marine Army, and a named character you can only run one of because he's a named character. At least they aren't Zangors. And lastly, the models. Twofold problem here, everyone. The first part is that the nicest thing I can say about painting them is that they aren't the Thousand Suns. But there's all this cloth and bone and armor plating and still plenty of trim, all of which has the underlying theme of looking both vibrant, decayed, and plague-ridden at the same time. There's lots of skin you have to paint people's innards because when you worship Nurgle, what's on the inside is sometimes on the outside, and overall, this army might be a bit difficult to paint. And of course, you have an army that's end result, even if painted by an absolute master of mini-painting, is going to have people going, wow, that looks like shit. Because that's the point. They're Nurgle worshippers. They look like, and may damn well be covered in shit. Someone who isn't familiar with the hobby might see them on your shelf, and their first thought might be, why did they leave a massive pile of shit on their shelf? So if you want the Death Guard, just accept that even when your models look phenomenal, they're gonna look horrible. And there's my analysis of the Death Guard. Get it as fast as you can, a difficult task to be sure, and spread the gifts of Nurgle to avoid thinking about the fact your dad hates everything you've become and would jump ship the moment he had a chance. As always, thank you to my wonderful channel members. You are the disease to my Death Guard, an integral part of this rotting carcass I call a YouTube channel. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching, and take care out there. I think if I could hit any one of the Horus Heresy characters that have lived into 40k in the head with a brick, it'd be Typhus. It was just kinda rude of him to force his Legion and Mortarion into Nurgle's sweaty, smelly arms. I'd say he deserves it the most. Erebus is a real prick, yeah, but with no Erebus, we'd get no 40k, and you see, that's a problem, so he has to stay. But get rid of Typhus, and it's not like Nurgle's gone anywhere. He's still around, there can still be Plague Marines, they just not necessarily be the Death Guard.